Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of China's DeepSeek Moment, a video series from Asia Society Policy Institute's Center for China Analysis. I am your host, Lizzie Lee, fellow on Chinese economy here at CCA. Today, we're diving into one of the most futuristic and fast-moving sectors in China's tech landscape, humanoid robotics. China's robotics push is moving really at breakneck speed, powered by deep-pocketed EV giants, government-backed industrial policies, and a rapidly evolving AI ecosystem. It is a sector that's getting serious capital, political backing, and media attention. But is it the next DeepSeek-style breakthrough, or are we just watching a hype cycle outpace reality? In this episode, we will unpack what China's humanoid robotics ambitions mean for global competition, industrial policy, and the future of automation at scale. I'm joined by two brilliant guests. We have John Lee, Toy Senior Fellow at Asia Society Switzerland and here at CCA, and Angela Shen, Chief Correspondent at China Talk, where she covers biotech, robotics, and AI. So let's get into it. Angela, I'm going to turn to you first. How does the current humanoid robotics landscape in China compare to global counterparts, say the US or Japan, in terms of tech maturity and commercialization?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I agree that this is a very exciting topic to be investigating. And so I'll address commercialization first. So just to be clear, around the world, nobody's figured out the commercialization question completely when it comes to humanoids. The costs to build a humanoid range from $10,000 to upwards of $300,000. And so it hasn't really become something that can be put on the mass market yet. Prices for purchasing humanoids range from $16,000 to $250,000. So again, the commercialization question is something that will hopefully be answered more clearly once technical problems have been solved and manufacturing challenges have also been addressed. With that being said, I will say that there are some leading Chinese players that are worth paying attention to that their global counterparts definitely are noticing. So for instance, Agibot, Fourier Intelligence, and Unitree Robotics. And I want to highlight Unitree for just a second, because even though I just said commercialization of humanoids hasn't happened yet, Unitree has quite a large market share for its quadruped robots. So it's like robot dogs. And they actually do have their Unitree G1 at a pretty reasonable price on the market. But the G1 is a very, very simplified version, more for hobbyists or for academics and researchers doing robot learning work. But it is something that is on the market. So Unitree is doing quite well in that. Beyond that, if we were to compare the China's landscape for humanoids and the global landscape more broadly, I would also want to point out that in China, because of the government investment and policies that I'm sure that John will also go into, things like subsidies and investment in infrastructure, there are just more people and companies working on humanoids in China. So China, if you look at data, for instance, on recent startups or recent launches of humanoids or recent patent filings that mention the word humanoid, the majority normally are coming from Chinese firms. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily very good humanoids. They could be quite not very advanced. But the point is that there are just so many of them because there's the resources available to encourage that.
Thank you so much. And John, picking up on what Angela just said, what's driving China's leap into humanoid robotics? Angela mentioned policy. How much of it is building on China's EV strength, automation strength, and how much of it is completely new terrain?
I think it's important to see this in the overall context of Chinese industrial development. The Industrial Internet of Things has actually been a focus of Chinese policy support for over a decade at this point. You've had multiple action plans which are aimed not at just developing the IoT, but also specifically the industrial Internet of Things. So the application of robotics and other technologies and the manufacturing sector, and in particular industry verticals, of which obviously automotive is the one which is in focus at the moment. So when it comes to robotics, obviously there are dedicated plans for that as well. But I think, again, it needs to be seen as part of an overall ecosystem in China, where the focus is very much on upgrading the economy as a whole. The particular focus on humanoid robots at the moment, at least if we go by the recent interview that the Unitree CEO gave in his own statement, indeed, as was the case with EV, seems to have been driven very much by the example set in the United States, and specifically by Optimus and Tesla. So the market is obviously potentially there. In the case of China, the issues with demographics, with the rising cost of labor in many of the manufacturing heartlands of the country are well known. I think the interesting question going forwards is what will be the case in terms of China's relationship with other developing economies. If we talk about the potential for robotic sales in developed economies, then the politics around Chinese technology are obviously not favorable at the moment. Though that said, I mean, here in Germany, where I'm located, you can certainly find, for example, components from Unitree and other Chinese robotics providers on the market. But I think that in terms of the potential for expansion, the focus would certainly be at this point in a context where obviously China is trying to strike a balance between the need to find internal motives for development and new export markets and opportunities for Chinese companies to scale overseas on more the developing world, and in particular on China's near abroad.
Great point on China's ecosystem and its strategy, both domestically and also internationally. John, I wanted to go a little deeper on software and AI, which we understand are still bottlenecks at this point. So will Chinese firms face the same roadblocks, as we've seen in semiconductors, like reliance on US AI model software platforms when it comes to robotics?
If we talk about hardware first, I think, again, if you look at it from an ecosystem viewpoint, the Chinese industry is probably capable of providing a lot of the necessary equipment and components at this stage. And perhaps it's a bit of a sidebar, but just this week at Semicon in China at the industry conference, you've probably seen it in the news. There's been a whole raft of announcements of new equipment products. This is for manufacturing semiconductors, so chip making, which are at least at face appearance at roughly competitive, let's say, with the international industry leaders. Now, when we talk about robotics also, again, if we are talking about many of the chips that you need to make a robot work mechanically, or the control functions, so for example, the microcontroller units that control many of the mechanical processes, many of the sensors that are involved, Chinese companies are probably, if you had to generalize, still lagging the international industry frontier, but they are catching up fast. And again, the domestic industry, you would have to say now, looks like it will be able to provide most of what's needed, let's say, within the next few years. If we talk about the advanced processing functions, so this is where, of course, we get onto AI models and the computing power that's required in order to train and also for inference work, then obviously China still faces a bottleneck there in terms of domestic industry's ability to provide the leading edge fabrication capacity, the chip making capacity, which has been provided historically by TSMC and other let's say, mainland vendors. But there also, you could potentially see a change in the coming years that simply remains to be seen. So that's on the chip making side. In terms of, again, many of the other components that are involved, there are other potential bottlenecks in terms of, for example, the machine tooling that you need for precision components. It's well known that this is another area in which, although you do have quite a large Chinese sector, they are not competing yet at the highest end with, let's say, the German and Japanese leading vendors of these products for computer numerical controlled machine tools. And you could use other examples. But overall, you would have to say that at this point, the cost advantages of the production ecosystem in China are really starting to weigh heavily against, let's say, the marginal technological lag that many of the Chinese vendors of these key systems and components still have relative to their foreign competitors. And when it comes to software, again, the news that's come out regarding Manus and DeepSeek, just regarding AI, is putting into perspective just how much potential the Chinese ecosystem has. Obviously, they have a lot of very talented people. It no longer appears to be the case as, let's say, if we were having this conversation 20 years ago, where you would say, well, the Chinese industry depends on people who have basically been trained up through the US ecosystem, through the university system and Silicon Valley and the big US tech companies. In that respect, also, I think that the prospects for the Chinese industry to move forward under its own steam in terms of software development, in particular, if we're talking about software optimized for particular applications and niches rather than, let's say, general purpose AI models, is increasingly looking very strong.
Thank you so much. So, John, you very helpfully zoomed in on some of the tech gaps that are currently sort of facing these Chinese companies. Angela wanted to zoom out a little bit to the gap between market expectations and reality. So, I recently came across this report by Goldman Sachs, which predicts that about 76,000 humanoid robots will ship by 2027. But currently, the market is pricing in something like 500K, shipment during the same period of time. So that's a huge gap. Are we just looking at another overhyped boom here, or is the market just early?
That's a really interesting question, and not one that I'm going to answer directly, maybe. So I'm going to clarify and just say that humanoid robots, the field is still in its infancy. And so we haven't seen who the clear market leader is yet. We also don't definitively have benchmarks for success. And so there are plenty of people working in the robotics space that do point out that there are other potential more viable paths for large-scale automation beyond the humanoid form. With that being said, there is an investment case for humanoids. So the fact that the world is already created by humans is something that people often cite. And so being able to ideally create a robot that you can just put in the same environments that were built for humans has a lot of value. And especially when you combine that with AI, the ability of AI will be massively amplified if it can now learn and engage with and affect the physical environment. So when I think John will talk about labor dynamics a little bit more, but if you think about the total market for humanoids as every part of the labor force that potentially could be replaced by humanoids, you can get some really massive estimates. And that's one of the reasons why people are so bullish. At the same time, again, since there are the sort of bottleneck challenges of different hardware and AI that has not reached the relative advancement level it needs to for humanoids, I do think it's worth making the point that success and incremental advancements towards humanoid robots could also have more profitable immediate term use cases. So if there are, for instance, in China, advancements in chip making or in AI that is supposedly supposed to be moving towards a general purpose humanoid, there will probably be other use cases for that kind of technological advancement. And so when you see investors really interested in these kinds of companies who are advertising humanoids because it is like one of the more attractive and eye-catching ways to advertise the firm's work, there's probably a lot of other kinds of innovation that might be also happening and having additional impacts beyond what is just from the humanoids. And so it is still a really exciting space in that way.
Thank you so much. And speaking of bullish sentiment, from the conversations I had with people who are sort of in the sector, interested in this sector, another reason is policy push. So, John, let's talk about the policy piece. Why is Beijing so bullish on robotics right now? From Robotics Plus initiative to different provincial subsidies. How are these shaping the sector's direction? And what does the investment landscape on Chinese robotics look like?
Well, obviously, it is still very much a supply side economic framework that the Chinese government works within. I mean, there's been a lot of talk recently about new initiative to boost the consumption side of the economy. That's a whole separate rabbit hole we could go down. But the default setting is still that China will solve its development problems essentially by developing the so-called new productive forces. So everyone is familiar with Made in China 2025, which of course is a very old policy statement at this point, but which I think still captures the spirit. And obviously many of the technologies, including specifically robotics that we're discussing here, were if not actually mentioned in MIC 2025 and the associated roadmap, in the various policy statements that have emerged over the succeeding decade. So I think that to a large extent, there's a perception on the part of the Chinese leadership that if not a silver bullet, this at least represents a objective pathway towards the overall goals that they have for Chinese society's development. Again, we come back to many of the objective constraints that China's facing: the aging population, the increasing cost of labor relative to much of the developing world, the need to increasingly compete in high technology industries where there are very formidable incumbents among the other advanced economies, so no longer just competing in lower value add sectors against other developing countries that have many disadvantages vis-a-vis China. So I think in that larger context, the focus on robotics at the moment is simply something that comes naturally. It's, again, the sort of sector where the way the Chinese system operates, where you can put out, let's say, very broadly phrased national policy goals and then iterate them down through supporting policies at the municipal and provincial government level, like a lot of, let's say, manufacturing and component-heavy sectors. It lends itself to that context. And also you have, as I mentioned, a larger environment in which China has become perhaps a leading country in terms of operationalizing the industrial Internet of Things. So the level of automation, although for the Chinese manufacturing sector as a whole, may be quite small. For the leading companies, is the players who are most advanced in this space is already quite high. I mean, you're seeing the stories of humanoid robots already being deployed in auto manufacturing plants, but there is a much wider picture of high levels of automation in manufacturing in China. Again, not across the whole manufacturing sector, but certainly among leading companies, which has been enabled by the supporting policies. So the development of the IoT platforms, for example, the relevant addressing systems for basically identification of devices across the network. All of these supporting ecosystems have been promoted by the Chinese state for a long time. They've had targeted programs to develop, for example, SMEs, the so-called little giants approach of developing not hyperscalers like the names that we're familiar with, but smaller Chinese companies which can fill the various niches. So you have a very conducive environment, certainly for use of robots on the factory floor, basically. And that, of course, maybe just to round this out, brings us back to AI. Obviously, if you're the country which has a very high level of connected smart manufacturing implemented on the factory floor, then that's feeding back data which can be used to further improve the existing models, but also potentially be used for improving AI development in a range of other contexts. And perhaps here it's worth noting in conclusion that the underlying architecture for transformer architecture for large language models, in many ways, you could say that there are similarities to the sort of learning that robots need to do to operate in a real world environment. And that in turn is potentially giving you, as I heard one analyst put it recently, an infinite reinforcement learning environment. Once the robots are capable of operating to a certain degree of competence, then you are effectively vastly increasing the data collection space that's available for developing AI in other contexts.
Thank you so much, John. John, you mentioned applications in manufacturing, logistics, et cetera, et cetera. So, Angela, I want to turn to you next. From a tech standpoint, what's holding back large-scale adoption of humanoid robots in, consumer side or, sort of beyond manufacturing, which we've seen a lot of cases here? Are there engineering hurdles, design hurdles? What are the roadblocks?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with the engineering hurdles. Much like John has already discussed, when it comes to AI, the truth is that the physical world is full of variation. And oftentimes, a home setting, especially like a normal consumer setting, is probably the most unpredictable and chaotic environment. You've seen everyone's bedroom is very different as a layout compared to, the average Amazon warehouse or facility might be able to have a pretty standardized layout that a robot could learn really quickly. And so having the kind of AI model that can learn and perform actions that aren't present in its training data and handle environmental variations is something that is still an engineering challenge. And one of the reasons it's so difficult is because there isn't really large enough data sets yet to be able to train robots to do a diverse array of tasks that it would justify their use. And so you see a lot of exciting partnerships here. For instance, Agility Robots and Amazon, and the same thing is happening in China in different aspects where a lot of the smart manufacturing, sort of like smart factories that John just mentioned, are probably really exciting pilot and robot training environments more than just for actual manufacturing and use once they're completed. And so because of that, since we're still working on the applying them in industrial settings, it will be quite difficult to be able to set up a robot that has the AI intelligence of it necessary to be able to function well in consumer settings. At the same time, other engineering trade-offs include hands. So having human hands have many degrees of freedom, which basically means we're very dexterous. We can move them in all sorts of different ways. And so for robots, there's still kind of a question of how you build a hand that is able to do really delicate tasks like picking up a mug and making tea or moving around objects in a pile. And that comes with trade-offs of things like size, weight, the battery of a robot as well, and the functionality. And so all of those things are still being ironed out. At the same time, there are other aspects of why consumers haven't been able to adopt humanoid robots in a large scale yet. And some of those might be related to social and policy and safety factors. So, there's a higher standard of safety if you have babies in the home or if you have dogs in the home, or you don't want a robot that can suddenly malfunction. And at the same time, levels of social acceptance for humanoid robots might differ across countries and regions. And then finally, the actual commercial case, which is essentially that based on the prices that humanoid robots are being sold at now, it doesn't really make sense for the average household to spend the equivalent of maybe like purchasing an electric vehicle for a robot that can do laundry when in fact, like you can pay a human to do laundry at a much cheaper cost. And so until those kinds of questions all get answered, it might be a long time for us to be able to see humanoids entering our homes.
Oh, thank you so much, Angela. And I'm going to ask you to take a guess here. Which sector do you think is most likely to adopt a humanoid robot? First, is it elderly care, consumer service? What's your estimate here? And what kind of timeline should we expect for the tech to go mainstream?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually also curious about what John would say here because this is definitely entering some speculative territory. But beyond just manufacturing logistics, which we've already pinpointed as kind of the entry point, I think that when you look at the factors that influence which places automation happens, it tends to be jobs that are more manual, jobs that are considered by humans to be boring, jobs that are considered dangerous for humans, or jobs that have tasks that are extremely repetitive. And so I would tentatively want to guess that if you were to apply that framework onto more consumer settings, that it might be more likely that you see a humanoid robot, for instance, restocking inventory in a retail store more soon than doing something complicated like elderly care, where every patient has different needs. Although there are some exciting applications of maybe not full AI plus humanoid robots, but other kinds of AI and robot applications that can enter those kinds of spaces a little bit earlier. But yeah, if I were to guess with consumer, then we would be talking about environments like retail stores or kitchens are another space where currently robots have been applied, and potentially humanoid form robots could potentially be applied in the future.
Thank you so much. And John, I'm gonna turn to you. So Angela also mentioned labor market and, sort of potential applications of robots and labor, as a potential solution to address China's aging society issue. If China succeeds in scaling humanoid robotics, if all those issues Angela just mentioned get resolved in time, how could this affect Chinese labor market? How could it potentially affect China's domestic economic implications?
Only the big, or rather the small questions, to use that joke properly, Lizzie. I think, again, humanoid robots are getting a lot of attention at the moment, but there's no necessary reason in most cases why a robot needs to take a humanoid form, right? And in industrial automation, of course, you have seen mainly non-humanoid robots in form being applied over the past decade. I personally don't see beyond some limited applications such as logistics. Angela already mentioned moving items around in the context of restocking inventory. You're talking about, let's say, a small retail operation. In outside some of those contexts, I'm not sure whether, again, a humanoid form is required in order to achieve the productivity gains, which are really the purpose of applying robots in large-scale industrial automation. If we wanted to use specific examples, well, again, the EV sector and automotive generally is getting a lot of attention at the moment, as Angela said, in cases where the work is not just repetitive and dangerous, but also requires a certain degree of physical robustness. This isn't the case with a lot of functions still in the automotive sector. Ideally, you want workers who are not in their 50s, but ideally in their 20s and in relatively good physical shape to be doing things like welding, for example. There are obvious cases for industrial automation and use of applied robotics, but again, that doesn't necessarily mean anthropoid form. In the case of consumer applications, I believe that if we were to use the healthcare example, there already are examples in Japan, for instance, of elderly care, of medical care being provided by robotic assistants who may not necessarily be fully humanoid in form, but where there is some advantage for the function in terms of having a shape which is, if not completely resembling a human, at least not completely alien. And it's often said that this is the sort of sector where artificial intelligence and automation is going to have the least application, or at least is going to come latest to the party, because again, the human element is considered so important. But if you think about some of the earliest uses of applied let's say, automation or forms of artificial intelligence in the consumer context, voice assistants, and so on, that you can actually imagine many uses in even at the level of the individual consumer, where again having some level of anthropomorphization might add value. But certainly, if we're talking about manufacturing, then I would suggest that it's much more important, rather than looking at the physical form of the robot, beyond, let's say, the need for manipulation of objects. So Angela already talked about the issues around dexterity. Obviously, there is a premium to be placed on imitating functions of the human form in that respect. But beyond that, it's much more important, again, to, in an industrial context, look at issues such as the networking of the entire system, the provision of the relevant components, how the data sets based on which you are training the overall ecosystem, which again, if you talk about the transition from an analog to a digital world, is an issue. Many factories in the past have had entirely paper records, for example. So all of these surrounding issues would be more significant, I would think, in many of the short-term applications that we're likely to see, certainly in the manufacturing sector, than whether the robot has a humanoid form or not.
Fantastic. And, speaking of, sort of further implications, I also wanted to mention the geopolitical dimension a little bit. How might China's advancement in robotics impact national security, particularly with military use? John, what's your take on that?
Well, to my knowledge, the only example of a Chinese robot confirmed case being used in a military application was actually the US Marine Corps putting a machine on one of Unity's robot dogs. I mean, there have been rumors, obviously, of Chinese robots being used in the fighting in Ukraine. And obviously, there's been extensive use of Chinese drones and certainly of Chinese manufactured drone components by both sides in that conflict. So again, I think that, as is often the case with these frontier technology sectors, you're likely to see a lot of these unsexy, let's say lower profile instances in the real world before you see, let's say, entire Chinese-made robotic exoskeletons, Starship Trooper style, used by soldiers on the battlefield. Even if you're talking about something like advanced applications of drones in a military context, drone swarming and so on, we certainly haven't seen any significant example of that in the Ukraine conflict. That's not to say that the People's Liberation Army, or for that matter, the US military, haven't already developed advanced AI and AI-enabled robotics applications, which we've yet to see. But again, what's coming out in the public domain so far is much more mundane in terms of applications which are often the same as those in the civilian sector. So if we're talking, let's say, about applications of AI, not necessarily of robotics, as such, by the People's Liberation Army or by military adjacent sectors in China. Or again, the examples that you see in the media are of, let's say, logistics optimization or enhanced healthcare, psychological counseling assistance for soldiers, which is automated through chatbots, this sort of thing. It's possible, I suppose, that we could see something that looks more like people's science fiction images in conflict in the next 5 to 10 years, which we obviously hope is not going to break out. But for the time being, I think that this is much more likely the space that the stories are likely to be coming out in. It's going to be things which very much reflect what's going on in the civilian sector being commercialized in terms of applications of robotics. Maybe one thing to mention is that, again, much more, I think, in the commercial and the civilian context, there has been some collaboration between Chinese and Russian actors, some of which has been state mediated over the past decade. You don't read much about that these days, but robotics is certainly something that, at least in the defense context, the Russian military-industrial complex was focusing on a lot. Again, we haven't seen many examples of that actually being applied in the fighting in Ukraine, which is not to say, again, that the Russians don't necessarily have that capability, but that's certainly something that I'm sure the intelligence agencies in Western countries are watching closely. And Again, there's a lot of unknowns there around how Russia's role in, let's say, the global defense supply space is going to evolve as a result of the conflict with Ukraine and how that's resolved or not over the next few years, and the opportunities or not that that may create for Chinese competitors or collaborators, as the case may be.
Fantastic. And Angela, I'm going to turn the final question to you. Are there part of the robotic industry, the humanoid robotics industry that we are missing? What do you wish our audience know better in addition to what we've discussed today?
That's a really thoughtful question. What do I think the audience should know better? I think it is not to reference again what we've already spoken about, but I think it is just a reminder that humanoid robots, you might see the videos online, you might see the CCTV Spring Gala recordings and see them and think, oh, like this is such a science fiction dystopian future. Soon we'll be seeing humanoid robots walking over the earth, like living in cities just like everyday people. And the reality is a little bit more complicated. There is a lot of investment coming in, and there are a lot of both companies and also academics who are working on these problems very diligently. But there are also still a lot of engineering problems left when it comes to humanoid robots. And so when our audience sees those sorts of videos, or you see like a robot that can walk around, I would just caution that, as exciting as that is, not to immediately take that at face value and assume that it is fully being operated on its own, or that it has complete advanced AI capabilities, and instead think about, like John kind of pinpointed, all the other movements that are being made in terms of robotics, and specifically industrial robots, in which China is actually quietly being a leader in, rather than only focusing on humanoids.
Right. Well, that's actually a really thoughtful response. If we're looking for the next deep seek, it's probably not going to be the sexy, fancy robots you see on social media. It's probably going to be something that doesn't look that great, but that has huge industrial or manufacturing implications and applications. So that wraps up our discussion. And huge thanks to John and Angela for joining me today and offering such nuanced and sharp insights into this fast-moving, high-stakes space. Thank you for tuning into this episode of China's Deep Seek Moment on humanoid robotics. I am Lizzie Lee, fellow on Chinese economy here at CCA. I will see you next time.